Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, a new podcast from FlightGlobal offering insight and analysis into the world of aviation. We'll be publishing episodes twice weekly. Join us every Friday for a review of the week's news, and again on Monday for a deep dive into one topic from the worlds of aerospace, defense, and airlines. I'm Ryan Finnerty, FlightGlobal's America's Defense reporter, and today we'll be discussing the recent air battle that took place high above the disputed border between India and Pakistan, and the long-term implications for Indian air power. Joining me are the rest of Flight's defense team, including Greg Waldron in Singapore and Craig Hoyle in London. Greg, Craig, good to speak with you today.
Great to be here, Ryan.
Hi, everyone.
So for our inaugural episode, we're discussing this murky engagement between the air forces of India and Pakistan and what it means for the competitive market for fighter aircraft. Little has been independently confirmed about the incident, which was part of a 4-day bout of hostilities between the two countries. The fighting began after a terrorist attack in northern India killed 26 people in April. India then responded by launching airstrikes against what it called terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan. The action included firing long-range cruise missiles from the Indian Air Force's French-made Rafale fighters. Pakistan responded with its own fighters and claims to have shot down a number of Indian Rafales, notably with the use of Chinese-made long-range missiles fired from Pakistan's J-10C fighters, which also come from China. The engagement was large, with dozens of combat jets reportedly involved. And interestingly, both sides are believed to have remained in their own airspace, trading long-range missile shots from beyond visual range rather than close-in dogfighting. Greg, you've been covering this story pretty extensively. What do we know about what actually happened, and what's been the fallout since the battle?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, this is certainly one of the biggest stories of military aviation this year. You had Pakistan very early on claiming that it shot down Indian jets, and there was even, evidence of aircraft crashed on the ground. Some of it might have been photoshopped. We don't really know. It's all still very murky, but we do know that India did lose some planes. We just don't know the exact extent. And of course, the Indians have come out recently and said that they've actually shot down several Pakistani aircraft using surface-to-air missiles. This is a claim that just came out. Specifically, they claim to have used the S-400, and of course, Pakistan denies that. So it's really hard to get to the essence of what actually happened in the air. But I think, looking forward, this has really significant implications for Indian air power. One of the features of the initial, action seems to have been, the Pakistani Air Force setting up a fairly effective kill chain, using airborne early warning and control aircraft to locate Indian fighters. And then, of course, the J-10Cs were able to fire the PL-15 missiles, resulting in kills. And that's really, kind of a big statement about Chinese aircraft and a big statement about Pakistani capability. And in the aftermath of the action, in early June, China said that it would basically is offering 40 stealth fighters, J-35s, to Pakistan, along with an unspecified number of KJ-500 airborne early warning and control aircraft. And the KJ-500 is China's best airborne early warning aircraft. And this is going to be creating a real issue for India because India is kind of behind on its defense procurement plans. The MiG-21, which they've been using for years, is about to be retired. The Tejas, which was really a program that's been going on for decades, is starting to enter service in limited numbers, but it's years behind schedule. And it's a fairly good fighter, but it's still, maybe a bit behind the times compared to the new Chinese types. They're upgrading their Su-30s, but that program has yet to really kick off. And they have their own stealth fighter called the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft. And a critical design review was completed in 2023. Development is underway, but they still actually have yet to determine who is going to build that aircraft. And at the very best, that aircraft, India's first homegrown stealth jet, is set to arrive at about 2036. So this means that they won't have a viable stealth fighter until the 2030s.
Yeah, so there are some options for them in the interim, I guess, notably the US-made F-35 and Russia's Su-57. We even heard the US President Donald Trump publicly suggest a few months ago that he would offer the F-35 to India. What are the prospects for either of those two aircraft?
Yeah, that was an interesting development earlier in the year when Trump sort of out of the blue announced that F-35 was going to be tossed into India's procurement plans. Reports suggest that India was quite annoyed with some of Donald Trump's tariff moves with India, specifically around, buying Russian oil and supporting Russia's war effort against Ukraine. And so apparently the Indians have backed away from the F-35. And, the F-35 was always kind of seen as a real long shot. The Indian Air Force would have had to make a lot of changes. It would have been a lot of work to incorporate that aircraft. And, it was never really seen as a really realistic sale for India. The other option was the Su-57, which is from Russia. Apparently that is still in the mix. The irony is that Russia and India were involved in that program back in the 2010s, and it was going to be called the Indian Fifth Generation Fighter Aircraft. But the Indians and Russians couldn't quite make that work. So the Russians just decided to move forward and do that program on their own. So India ended up not getting the FGFA. And then the other major thing that's happened as well is they've had another competition for aircraft that's been actually going on for probably about 20 years. I mean, I remember the first air show I covered for Flight was Aero India in 2011, where Craig and I were covering a competition called the acronym right, the Medium Multi-Role Combat Aircraft Competition. And this was going to be for 126 jets. And they went through these fighters. There was a big fly-off. It was a massive competition. It was the biggest fighter sale in the world at the time. And then they chose the Rafale, but then this was abruptly canceled in 2015. And this was, I think, one of the big sticking points was that India was dissatisfied with the amount of technology transfer they were going to get from Dassault with the Rafale. In the end, India had to go and buy 36 Rafales off the shelf. So they've kind of revived this competition in recent years. It's basically the son of MMRCA, and it's called the Medium Role Fighter Aircraft, MRFA. And supposedly an RFP is coming at the end of this year. But it's a real mix of fighters. You've got some European jets, and then you've got some American jets. And now I've also heard that I saw a report that the Korean KF-21 is also in this competition.
And Greg, you mentioned India's use of the S-400, the Russian-made air defense system. That notably was a major sticking point that caused the U.S. to remove Turkey from the F-35 program. Is that likely to be an issue or consideration in this competition? We can assume that would eliminate the F-35 as a contender.
I would think so. Trump might get up there and say, look, we're offering the F-35, but I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. I'm sure there's been some background discussions between the U.S. government and India about the F-35, that kind of thing. But I think if push came to shove and they're really getting close to doing a deal, I think India's close relationship with Russia, its use of the S-400 would really be a stumbling block for that sale going through, particularly under a future administration.
Greg mentioned that a few European manufacturers are in contention. I'm sure they would love to secure a sale. What's the landscape look like for the companies that you cover in Europe?
Yeah, so basically in Europe, we've got 3 in-service fighter types, and all 3 of them are in the mix for the MRFA requirement. So that's the Dassault Rafale, Eurofighter Typhoon, and Saab Gripen. Interestingly, all of those types were also in the earlier MMRCA contest. And as Greg said, I mean, we covered Aero India 2011, where it really peaked, that competition. And it was a bit of a rock star show, really. So you had US competitors especially went absolutely all out to try and win it. And they were flying all manner of celebrities, so Bollywood stars, sports people, to really raise the profile of their jets. So scroll on a bit longer, it narrowed down to just the Rafale and the Typhoon. Rafale came out on top. But as Greg mentioned, they couldn't actually get to a contract because the cost was so high in the end. So India went on a few years later and bought 36 Rafales. And very recently, the Navy has also ordered 26, which will be in the Rafale M carrier version. So that's a kind of interesting one where Dassault gets its first customer for that version. So anyway, that's sort of a bit of a history lesson. But so for today, all three of those European programs have got hot production lines. They've got strong order backlogs, which run well into next decade. And that means that they will be in a good place if India continues at its traditional procurement pace, which is, of course, notoriously slow, very bureaucratic. Technology-wise, the jets on offer there, we'd call them Generation 4.5. So they're not stealthy aircraft, but they've got a lot of advanced capabilities. So India would be offered active electronically scanned array radars, broad array of precision-guided weapons, and also electronic warfare equipment to help protect those aircraft. They've also all got capabilities coming online in a few years' time that are in development now. So by the start of next decade, that'll include the ability to fly with unmanned collaborative combat aircraft. And they're also likely to get a few bits of equipment in the terms of Rafale and Typhoon that would be drawn from Europe's sixth generation fighter programs, which are FCAS and GCAP. I'm pretty sure we'll cover that in a future podcast. So Greg mentioned about the local industry element to this. So whatever an MRFA contest is, India's going to need a lot of local work to be done, and that will include assembling the bulk of the aircraft that it buys. So there's a parallel. Eurofighter Consortium member Airbus is already doing that with the C295 transport aircraft, partnered with Tata. But among the three European fighter companies, only Saab is currently letting somebody else build their aircraft. So Embraer is going to be doing final assembly on some of the Gripenese that the Brazilian Air Force is taking. So there's lots of interesting sort of angles on where they might look to gain a benefit over maybe some US rivals. But interestingly, as the day we're reporting this, the Times of India have come out with an article saying that the Indian Air Force is favouring a follow-on buy of Rafales just because it will be quicker than staging a full competition. And I think this is really an important point, that if that proves to be the case, then that really suggests strongly that if India did lose any Rafales in its recent skirmish with Pakistan, that's likely to be because of the manner in which it employed the aircraft, rather than there being an actual problem with Rafale, which is in service with lots of other nations around the world. So just sort of at a summary level, I don't really get the sense that this competition is moving terribly fast. When we talk to company executives at the big air shows, they might mention India in their prospects list for fighter sales, but it's not really top of the list. We'll wait and see, but I think if India does sort of signal it's interested in moving forward quickly, this is a story that's going to get a lot of attention in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's a really similar situation in the US, Craig, with the two main fighter manufacturers being Boeing and Lockheed Martin. They'd both love to get a sale in India, but it's maybe not the most promising prospect for either company. Lockheed is offering the F-21, which is a version of the famous F-16 configured specifically for India. That would be produced in partnership with Indian manufacturer Tata. And Boeing has the F-15EX, which is also in active production, although at the time we're recording this, the assembly line workers are on strike. Both of those options fall into that 4.5 generation category that you mentioned, Craig, which is sort of a modernized version of a fourth generation fighter. And I think what's really interesting about those two options is that, at least for approved customers, they come with these advanced electronic warfare packages that are meant to help them survive against modern air defenses and more advanced or newer fighters, because as you mentioned, these are non-stealth aircraft. And there was a report by the Pentagon earlier this year that found the F-15EX was assessed to be operationally effective, that was the term, in the air superiority role, even against fifth generation adversaries, which, could maybe be an interesting option for India. As Greg mentioned, they're sort of at a disadvantage when it comes to stealth aircraft. And so you have something that's available and has been shown to be effective from the US. And Greg, you wrote a really interesting analysis recently looking at that disparity between India and Pakistan when it comes to the stealth capability for their air forces. How does that factor in? And maybe you could also elaborate on sort of what Craig mentioned, that it's not just the aircraft, but how they're employed that seem to matter in this engagement, and Pakistan seeming to be more effective at that type of kill chain development and networking all of these different platforms together to prevail.
Yeah, certainly, Ryan. China for years at, the Zhuhai Air Show and other events that, Chinese defense executives attend, they've always been very open about talking about kill chains and how they work. I mean, I remember seeing at the Zhuhai Air Show all throughout the 2010s, very elaborate diagrams of kill chains. And we've even seen very senior, Chinese aerospace guys talking about how important the kill chain is. So, for example, the J-35, which is the aircraft that Pakistan will be getting from China at some point, is seen as this kind of like really crucial data node. And that really gets back to the Chinese concept of like informationalized warfare. It's really about, it emphasizes gaining information dominance over your opponent. So in the case of India, you've got a very acute problem in the sense that you've got China's very much built up its bases, in the Himalayas, and they've been operating a initial stealth type, the J-20, for some years now. So they have a lot of experience with that. And now the J-35A, which is the land-based version of the J-35. The J-35 baseline version is a naval aircraft, but the J-35A, which is going to be entering service with the People's Liberation Army Air Force as well, and that will be potentially based in the Himalayas. And then, of course, you have over here on the side, you've got Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan has a kind of a mixed force. They've got some old Mirages, they've got some old F-16s, but the real trend in recent years is, the Chinese equipment. They have a lot of JF-17s, which they co-develop with China. That's a very effective fighter. And then, of course, the proven J-10C. And the big thing that they really emphasize with the J-10s is that network effect, setting up that kill web, being able to detect the enemy at extremely long ranges, and then to be able to cue a shooter to attack without the target really knowing what's happening. And of course, if Pakistan gets stealth fighters, and I have no reason to see why they would not, because China's become very generous in supporting Pakistan's military ambitions. What you're going to see is, these stealth fighters, I mean, of course, they have very good data, fifth generation aircraft. They have very good sensing capability, very good data networking capability, and they should have good sensors, and they'll be able to get much closer, and it's going to be that much more difficult for the Indian Air Force to see them. So India's getting, they've had their issues procuring aircraft. They've had their issues developing aircraft over the years. But I feel that the next decade, this is going to become an even more acute problem for India.
And Greg, how about this Chinese-made PL-15 missile? That seems to have played a big role in this engagement, and one of the first times, if not the first time, we've seen it deployed operationally. What's the significance of that weapon system, and how does it impact the balance of power both between India and Pakistan and maybe across the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, man. It's really hard to understate the significance of the PL-15 if it performed as well as we believe it did, or as it reportedly did. Chinese aircraft, up until a few years ago, and Chinese weapon systems weren't deemed to be very good. But I feel that China's invested a great deal in its air power. It's invested a great deal in its pilot training. It's invested a great deal in its technology. And I really think that they're starting to develop some very capable systems. I mean, they still are behind in areas like, jet engines. They still are catching up in some areas. Maybe in sensors, they still have some way to catch up, but they've invested a lot in it, and their capability to manufacture things at scale is really second to none. I mean, they can throw a lot of resources at these things. And so the PL-15, is a very good example of that. It's a weapon that is basically designed, from our understanding, to go after high-value aerial targets. You'll have it on something like a J-20, a stealthy aircraft. Imagine like a war in the Western Pacific. You'll have a very, wild electronic warfare thing, and these J-20s can come streaking through. They're very hard to detect, and they're able to pop off these long-range missiles at key American support aircraft, such as tankers, such as, the AWACS plane, things like that. And that's pretty much the same weapon that is being deployed now by Pakistan. So it's a very effective long-range capability. And I think if it's coupled with a stealth aircraft, such as J-20, or in the case of Pakistan, J-35, it's going to be even more effective than it was when employed by the J-10 in the recent clashes in early May.
We've been talking about India and Pakistan, Greg, but what do you think the success of, or apparent success of that missile, the PL-15, what do you think that means for the United States as it's thinking about a potential conflict around Taiwan with China? If you're a planner sitting at Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu or at one of the big air bases in Japan, what are you thinking about now that you've seen this long-range missile work? Maybe what has to change now that that's the reality?
I think it creates a real conundrum for the U.S. military because we have the old E-3 Sentry, and that aircraft a few years ago, I think it was the head of the Pacific Air Forces at the time. Even he said that aircraft was having a really hard time developing good tracks on stealthy aircraft such as the J-20. Also, too, the U.S. is going to be very reliant on tanking. That's your KC-46, your KC-135s. In any conflict in the Western Pacific over Taiwan or around the South China Sea, whatever it might be. And I think that the PL-15 has, a real ability to hold those really valuable, really crucial American assets at very long ranges, especially if you combine it with, stealth aircraft, if you also combine it with, all the other things that are part of China's kill chain. They'll have extensive surface-to-air missiles. You're going to have warships that are, part of that system, all networked together. So it's not only the specific weapon, but I think it's also how China is possibly capable of networking these things extremely well together to make a very redundant kill chain that'll be very difficult for the U.S. forces to pick apart.
Yeah, and I think it's really valuable for China to have sort of a test ground to see how these systems perform. That's definitely something that the U.S. has done in Ukraine with the weapons that have been provided to the Ukrainian armed forces and seeing what works and maybe what doesn't work. So that's certainly seeing what happens in India and Pakistan will allow them to refine that process even further. But we'll have to save that for another podcast because we're just about out of time today. But that was a fascinating discussion, guys. Thanks for joining me, and we'll speak again soon.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more about the air battle between India and Pakistan or global fighter aircraft production, we'll have links to all our reporting in the show notes. Join us again on Friday for a roundup of the week's aviation news with some other members of the FlightGlobal team, and again next Monday for another deep dive. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio production by Lucy Johnson. If you have comments about today's episode or want to become a sponsor of the podcast, please email podcast@flightglobal.com. Find future episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. I'm Ryan Finnerty. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for FlightGlobal Focus.